Good morning, everyone. Welcome to session 2 of our fundraising series exclusively for Black and Latinx founders. I'm really excited today for this session on the elevator pitch. So telling your story is often the most underestimated aspect of the fundraising process, and it's not something that all of us are naturally born to do well. And I'm really excited to be welcoming our speaker this morning, Steph Patterson. But before I do want to share a little bit about Spiro Ventures and who we are. So we invest in founders who are building the things that make life worth living. And that is across 3 core areas: well-being, work and purpose, human connection. My name is Ha Nguyen. I'm one of the founding partners of Spiro Ventures, and we had spun out of a media network 2.5 years ago to form Spiro Ventures. And our thesis when we spun out was that we really believe that the best companies of our generation will be both purpose-driven and also produce outsized returns. So these are companies like eBay, where Shapria and I sort of grew up in the earliest days of eBay as a startup. And then Tesla, and one of our partners, Mark Tarpening, is the co-founder of Tesla. So these are the types of companies that we want to be backing. We are different from many VC firms in that we have a single LP, and that is Pierre Omidyar, who was the founder of eBay, and he wants to deploy his wealth to making the world better. And so therefore, he's excited to be working closely with us to be backing the next generation of amazing founders who are building mission-driven companies that can get to venture scale. And all of us on the team are former startup founders and operators, and we embody, hopefully, the spirit of the founder journey, which this year's theme is never give up. So throughout our session, if there's some great insights that you want to share with your friends on social, feel free to use our hashtag @SpiroVentures, and also you can use fundraising, storytelling, and Stephanie, I was looking for your Twitter. Do you have a Twitter by chance? In case folks want to tag you on Twitter?
It's smaria82 @smaria82. I'm not super active on it.
Okay, yeah. Or you can find Steph on LinkedIn. So that's great. And so with that, I'll kick it off to Stephanie. So a little bit about Stephanie. So Stephanie comes to us from the presentation design firm Duarte, which is one of the best storytelling firms on the planet. She spent many, many years there, 6 years there, before going off on her own and working with probably dozens and dozens and maybe 100 startups to help them tell their stories. She's right now a founder and partner at Revelator, I believe is how you pronounce it. We had her speak at one of our events 2.5 years ago. She was one of our highest rated speakers, and her content today that we actually do have up online is still one of the most viewed and most highly rated content that we have ever had all time. So I am pleased and thrilled to be welcoming back Stephanie. You're going to love this session today. She's going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then we're going to open up for live audience Q&A. So with that, Stephanie, it is all yours, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let you take it away.
Great, thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in today. I'm excited to be with you on Zoom. So let me get my screen shared here, and we will get started. Let's see. All right. Okay. And someone give me a thumbs up. You can hear me and you can see a slide that says pitching your startup. Are we good to go, Brandon, Veronica?
Yep, you're all
I
set.
believe you are, yes.
Awesome, thank you guys. Okay, well, Ha gave me a quick introduction. Thank you for that, Ha. Just to share a little bit more about that, you know, one of the things that I find really rewarding in my work is working with founders of early stage startups. I did spend about 7.5 years at Duarte, and that's where I really learned to love the presentation medium, and even more than presentations, to fall in love with business storytelling. And that's what I've been doing for the past 10 years out on my own now. And a huge portion of my work is with startups, early stage, where a lot of times you're just pitching the concept, the idea. You don't necessarily have the traction that you might have later in your journey. And so what you're really selling is your idea. And so that's what I want to talk about today. And specifically, I want to dial in and focus on the elevator pitch. Elevator pitch is something that's absolutely critical, as Ha mentioned, but it's also something that, you know, as operators and as entrepreneurs and people focused on execution, sometimes we don't give our attention to. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And, you know, we're all in this brand new world now, right? It used to be that investor conversations would happen one-on-one in a conference room over coffee, and you'd have the opportunity to, you know, read body language and use your facial expressions and all of those nonverbal communication things that now we don't really have available to us, right? We're doing things over Zoom. We're doing things just like we are today. These workshops I used to do in person and now are happening virtually. But the advantage I think that that gives us is that there's also this opportunity to really perfect your pitch and to spend a lot of time honing it, memorizing it, moving beyond memory to where you feel really comfortable, so that you can deliver it really powerfully virtually. So in terms of where the elevator pitch fits in the sequence of investor conversations, this is how I think about it. Typically, ideally, when you're connecting with an investor, you're going to have a warm introduction to that person. Maybe it's a former colleague or you know, classmate of yours that introduced you to someone with an email. And then after that, your first conversation is where you're going to use your elevator pitch. A lot of times that's happening exactly like this session is happening this morning. The elevator pitch is really what you say, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Next week, I will be speaking again, and we're going to focus on what I would see as the next step in the investor sequence of conversations, which is the flat deck. That is what you send. So sometimes these might be reversed. Sometimes you might send a flat deck before you have a meeting, but either way, your elevator pitch is very, very important because it's what's going to get that person interested enough to say, I want to know more, and to schedule a second meeting. So, you know, if you were meeting with Ha one-on-one, you would give her your elevator pitch. If she wants to know more, she might ask for your flat deck. And then ultimately, hopefully that's going to lead to a second meeting where she brings in another partner like Shri Priya to, you know, vet the idea a little bit more. So elevator pitch and what we say and the narrative is really what we're focusing on today. Here's what David Cowan, who's a partner at Bessemer, says about the elevator pitch. He says, I know it sounds a little crazy, but I've come to believe that a clear, compelling elevator pitch is essential to growing a business, and I've paid dearly for the evidence. Now, there's two things I want to highlight in David's quote here that will really define how we spend the rest of our time today. The first word is clear, and that really speaks to the content of your pitch, what you include. Compelling is really about the structure. It's how you design an arc for the pitch that's going to persuade people to want to know more. And both of them are really, really important. So when it comes to content, whenever I'm preparing a presentation, I always go to my audience and I think, what is it they want to know? So when we're talking about an elevator pitch and what investors want to know, these are what I see as the 5 questions that you need to answer as an entrepreneur, as a founder. First and foremost, what is your idea? This sounds obvious, but I'm telling you, it gets missed a lot. I have talked to different VCs and investors who said one of the biggest mistakes they see from entrepreneurs is they get to the end of the pitch and they still don't exactly know what their product or solution is. So we're going to talk about that a little more. The second thing is, how does your idea solve a key customer pain point? This is where we're really connecting what we're working on to a problem in the world. How big is the opportunity? What's at stake, really? What's your unfair advantage? And how will your idea change the world? So when we think about these 5 questions, for me, it defines 5 areas of content that I think need to be in every elevator pitch. And these are areas that as you're developing your pitch, you want to explore, you want to dig into, and you want to start crafting them to then stitch together into a narrative. So the answer to what is your idea is a single sentence description. Problem solved illustrates the pain point that you're solving. What's at stake speaks to the opportunity. Why us and why now, the 2 whys, speak to your unfair advantage. And the promised land vision is how that idea will change the world. But here's the thing, you can have all of these boxes checked, all of this content, and you may still have just an okay pitch, because the real difference between a good pitch and a great pitch is how you arrange and present those ideas. And that's where that structure comes into play. This is the compelling aspect of a pitch. Nancy Duarte is the founder of Duarte, where I really fell in love with storytelling. And while I was there, she was working on a book called Resonate. It's a great book, and it's really all about business storytelling. And when she was doing research for the book, she looked at dozens and dozens of presentations and speeches, everything from Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech to Steve Jobs' 2007 iPhone launch. And as she was looking at these, what she discovered was all these great presentations and speeches had a very similar narrative structure. Now, any of you that are English majors or anything like that, you're going to understand narrative structure and story arc, right? These are things that come from literature. They come from movies. They come from the world of storytelling. But this is the structure, the sparkline, as she calls it, of a great presentation. And what you'll notice is that it's going back and forth throughout the presentation from the world as it is, right? What is, to what could be. And it starts with what's called the call to adventure, which is borrowing a term from storytelling, which is the initial moment where you present your idea. And it ends on a new bliss, which is essentially that promised land vision. How's the world going to change when your idea has been adopted? And so when we're thinking about an elevator pitch, what's core to this sparkline is contrast, the back and the forth, the world as it is, the world as it could be. And the more you make yourself a student of good presenters, you will see that this is inherent in how they talk about their ideas. So we're going to dig in, and as we go through each of these sections of the 5 areas, the 5 questions your pitch must answer, we're going to look both at content and structure, different ways that we can present this that's more compelling and more persuasive. And we're going to start with the single sentence description. Now, I find that one of the best ways to learn is from watching great presenters and watching different examples. So I'm going to start with a video on this next slide. We're going to watch it. It's about 1.5 minutes. And this is with an entrepreneur named Christopher Gray. He founded a company called Scully. They were actually on Shark Tank. We're one of the popular Shark Tank guys. And I want you to listen in his presentation for things that just really catch your attention. And we're going to kind of break it down afterwards in terms of some of the narrative devices that he's using.
Hi, I'm Christopher Gray. I'm 26 years old. I'm the founder and CEO of Scholar, an app that helps students find scholarships for college. So I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, to a single mom. I'm the first in my family to go to college and graduate. I was actually going to school right when the recession hit. So when that happened, my mom lost her job, and a lot of people in my family lost their job. Went to school, made good grades, but a lot of schools weren't giving out aid during that time because they were short on endowment. So what I did was I had to find scholarships at college. It took me about 8 months to find all the different scholarships that I qualified for. I went through websites, had to go through these scams, things that would say, you can get $20,000, but give me your social security number. Long story short, I won $1.3 million in scholarships. I think throughout that process, I saw that there was all this money out there and students didn't know they existed. And then when I went to college, I was working with a lot of students. I'm volunteering with a lot of students at schools in Philly. I was thinking of how could I scale my efforts? How can I help as many of these kids as possible? And that's why I really created Scholarly. Actually, when I started it, my intention even wasn't to start a business. It was really just to help as many people as possible. And so we built the algorithm that aggregates all those different opportunities based on what you specifically qualified for. So it turns the months of looking for scholarships into minutes.
All right. So what did we hear in that presentation? I'm just going to stop my video because it said internet connection was unstable. What did we hear in Christopher's little interview there that I think is really telling of a great elevator pitch? Well, the first thing, in terms of his single sentence description, he starts with that right at the beginning. He says, Scholarly is an app that helps students find scholarships for college. Very, very easy to understand. I know exactly what the product is, right? It's an app. And I know the key benefit, which is that it helps students find scholarships for college. He also did something really great, and we're going to talk about that too, in terms of illustrating his problem solved, which is he told a very personal story of his own life and the difficulty in finding scholarships. He said, it took me like 8 months to find all the different scholarships I qualified for. And so this really became the beginning of this idea. Stories are a really powerful way to illustrate a problem solved. And finally, he said, I saw there was all this money out there, but students didn't know it existed. So here he's painting this contrast, right? There's all this available, and the people who need it most don't get it. So just kind of using that element of contrast to build into the problem and to really tee up the opportunity. The other thing that he did that I think is really, really great is he used these repeatable, tweetable moments, right? He said at the very end, we turn months of looking for scholarships into minutes. Well, that's really memorable. It almost has a rhyme, it rhymes, right? Months into minutes. And what's powerful about this, and what's so important about including these moments in your elevator pitch, is that these are the things that people will take and repeat and spread your message, which is exactly what needs to happen. In that initial investor meeting that we talked about, where you share your elevator pitch, your ultimate goal is for someone to be able to walk away from that and very easily tell that same message to somebody else. Hey, I met with a company this morning that actually takes the process of looking for scholarships and turns it from months into minutes. Well, now you have something that's really repeatable, really easy for someone to pick up on and spread that message. So this is the kind of message crafting that you need to do in your elevator pitch. So where do you start? Let's talk specifically with the single sentence description. So I want to take you through an example of how we might simplify one. Probably all of you are familiar with Evernote. So this is just a phrase or a sentence I found on their website that I think is a good example of single sentence description, right? It says, Evernote is a note-taking app that helps you capture and prioritize ideas, projects, and to-do lists so nothing falls through the cracks. So pretty great, pretty straightforward, but it is a little bit long. It's a little bit wordy. It's probably not easy for somebody to repeat. Let's see if we can edit this down a little bit. Well, if I take out the part that it's a note-taking app and just have that be implied, it simplifies it a little bit, right? It just says Evernote helps you capture and prioritize ideas, projects, and to-do lists. Maybe I can make it even simpler. Okay, Evernote helps nothing fall through the cracks. All right, now I'm getting right to the core benefit, but what I don't like about this is that it's kind of a negative, right? It's here's what won't happen. How can we change this to a positive? Well, what if we rewrote it as Evernote helps you remember everything, right? Because that's really the core benefit that it's driving home. And then maybe we simplify it even more to Evernote, remember everything. And here, what you're seeing in this construct, in even just 2 words, is what that product helps you do, which is remember, and what's unique about how it does it, which is it helps you remember absolutely everything. So a really easy template for you to think about when you're writing your single sentence description is to start with potentially a value proposition where you're actually defining the product, the customer, and the key benefit. But then self-editing, removing unnecessary words to where you get down to something as simple and pithy as even a couple of words. Because the easier it is for somebody to spread your idea, the easier it is for someone to pick up on it, the more likely that's going to happen, the more likely it's going to really hook them. Now, of course, there's a lot more that we probably want to know about Evernote if we're just hearing about it. But again, this is an elevator pitch. I don't need to go into, all of the in-depth details around how it all works. What I really want to do is I want to hook my audience. All right, so let's talk a little more about problem solved. So I mentioned that Christopher Gray used a story to illustrate his problem. That's a really powerful way to do it. And I always encourage startups that I'm working with to say, how can we tell a story here? How can we illustrate this through a real world customer facing problem, right? In his story, he was essentially the student, right? That's the kind of story that we want. But there's other ways to do this. And one of my favorite ways is to brainstorm analogies. So again, when I'm working with startups, a lot of times my first, time with them before we even begin the pitch is like a 2-hour session. And in that session, we will do all kinds of brainstorms and activities. One of the things I almost always include is an analogy brainstorm. So probably every single one of you has heard, somebody say something when they're pitching a company like, it's Uber for florists, or it's eBay for interior designers, right? These are metaphors, right? We're taking a company that is successful and that exists, and we are referring to it so people have now in their mind a construct for whatever you're pitching. Those can be helpful. I think they can also be a little bit overused, especially, I remember for the longest time, every pitch I was hearing was like, well, we're Uber for this, we're Uber for that. But you can move beyond just comparing yourself to another company to coming up with an analogy that really speaks to the value you deliver. So a couple years ago, I was working with a startup that's now doing really well. They were, their initial round was filled in by Google Ventures, and they're in the business intelligence space. Well, business intelligence, if you're not familiar with it, is basically what large companies use to mine their data for insights, right? So they'll buy from Oracle or Tableau or IBM, different solutions that help them mine mountains and mountains of data. And one of the things with business intelligence at the time that this company was pitching was that it was a really crowded space. Lots of people were innovating in it because, frankly, a lot of the solutions didn't work. And so we knew we needed messaging that would really differentiate and set this company apart from the others. So in a session with them, we started with this prompt for our analogy brainstorm. Today, business intelligence is like. And we came up with a bunch of ideas, but these were just a few that rose to the surface. With each of these, what we were trying to get at was some of the core problems with business intelligence today. And that's that by the time you have the answers, they're out of date. You know, it takes so long to mine that data that you don't actually get anything insightful from it. So GPS without traffic updates or the printed Zagat guide really resonated. This idea of a conversation with a mime, right? You're desperately trying to understand, but it's very, very difficult. And then what we did is we asked ourselves a second question, which is, okay, but with us, it's like, and then we built on each of these. So if before it was like the printed Zagat guide, now it's like having Yelp on your phone. If before it was like a hardline telephone, now it's like Ask Siri, right? There was this idea of immediacy, of getting the answers as fast as you can. If before it was like talking to a mime, now it's like having a conversation with your best friend where you literally can finish each other's sentences, you know? And so out of this, as we worked to develop their messaging, one of the phrases that ended up in their elevator pitch was this: we make asking questions of your data as easy as having a conversation. And what we loved about this is it really drove home the difference between the current experience of long, slow, arduous data mining that takes weeks and weeks to finally get insights from, to something that feels immediate, it feels natural, and you get a picture in your mind of what this looks like, right? You know what it's like to have a conversation with someone. You know how easy that is just to go back and forth. So coming up with an analogy is a great way to illustrate your problem, and it could be a great way to illustrate your solution as well. So let's talk about what's at stake. This is really about defining the size of the opportunity. And you know, most of you are probably familiar with this framework for market sizing, the TAM, the SAM, and the SOM. And to borrow an analogy here to explain this, when you're talking about market sizing, you've got your total addressable market, which is, you know, all the fish in the sea. The serviceable attainable market is the fish within casting range of your boat. And the serviceable obtainable market is the fish that you can reasonably catch. Now, when you're doing a more in-depth pitch, all of these things are important. In an elevator pitch, what I recommend is focusing on two things. Number one, that the market's big, and sometimes this can be done without even data, and we're gonna see that in a minute. And the second thing, and this is probably even more important in my mind, is to convince your audience that you have a path to get to that market. You have a strategy, a place you're gonna start, and you're gonna win. So we're gonna watch this other pitch.
Hi, I'm Elle, co-founder and CEO.
We're gonna watch this other pitch. This is from actually a digital demo day that happened in the spring for 500 startups. And what I want you to listen for is some of the elements that really capture your attention, specifically around the opportunity and their path to get there. Oops, there we go.
Hi, I'm Elle, co-founder and CEO of The Atlas, which is unlocking the local government market. Did you just hear the phrase local government and think GovTech? No thanks. I get it. Selling to government is the worst. This actual quote from a city official explains why that process can take up to 2 years. Cities hate getting sold things. Instead, they rely on recommendations from other cities to decide what to buy and build. Meanwhile, companies are bombarding city officials with emails that don't get read and sending huge sales teams to conferences just to get ignored on the expo floor. The future of our cities shouldn't rely on getting lucky at a conference. Our team met working in the Obama administration. Then we left to work together for 5 years to advise over 20 cities on how to invest in innovation. We understand how cities make decisions and how horrible it is to sell to cities. That's why we built the Atlas. The Atlas is a free online community that cities use to decide what to buy and build more quickly. City officials use the Atlas to browse case studies, follow trending topics, and post questions. Since joining 500 Startups, so in the last 4 months, we've grown our community 10x. Because we've aggregated all those city officials in one place, companies like OpenGov and Verizon are paying us a subscription fee for targeted marketing, sales intelligence, and to increase their deal flow. We're growing quickly because it's working. Our company customers have already seen their sales cycles shrink from 18 months to as short as 6 months. And I'm not kidding you, city officials have asked us to add a buy now button. Our next step, building a marketplace on top of the Atlas's already vibrant online community. US cities will spend 1.6 trillion of your taxpayer dollars this year on software, technology, and services. Can you imagine how transformed your community will be when cities can stop using Pinterest and instead click a button to buy everything from software to sensors on the Atlas? We can. Want to help us finally unlock the local government market? Email me.
Okay, so let's break down a couple things she did really well in this pitch in terms of market traction. So one of the things I loved is that she peppered phrases throughout her 2-minute pitch that were continually coming back to the size of the opportunity. So she did use 1.6 trillion, right? Just that's the size of what they're spending on software and solutions right at the beginning, and then she comes back to it at the end. Now, what about their path to get there? How did she really build that case? Well, she said, we spent 5 years working with cities. You know, after they met at working for the Obama administration, they had 5 years under their belt working with cities. So you know they've got some credibility in this space. And then the momentum, right? They've grown the community 10x in 4 months. And then finally, cities are now asking for a buy now button. Well, how great. That's their next step, is to become a marketplace, and cities are already asking for it. So all of this builds a sense of momentum throughout her pitch that gets an investor interested and gets them wanting to know more. So why us and why now? This really speaks to the unfair advantage. There's a lot of people out there coming up with solutions, and a question I guarantee you're going to get from investors is, why you guys and not somebody else? So how do we answer this, and how do we be prepared for it? Well, you have to provide some evidence to your listener that you can do this. But here's the thing, a lot of startups think of evidence as traction. And when you're early stage, you may not necessarily have traction. And so maybe go, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm just going to focus on the idea. But here's what I would challenge you to do. I challenge you to really redefine the idea of traction in your mind, to be with this question, asking yourself, how are you delivering value right now? Even if you're early stage, even if what you're pitching is still in a prototype, right? How are you delivering value right now? And when you ask yourself this question, it opens up way, way, way more opportunity to think about evidence. It could be your team. It could be that you have defensible IP. Maybe you're the first to market. Maybe you got successful pilots. There's a whole lot of other ways to think about traction versus just numbers. Now, of course, if you have numbers, if you have revenue, it's good. But if you don't, still explore this area. Team is one of the things I think is so important when you're early stage. And so I always encourage startups I'm working with to write a single sentence description for their team too. So, every one of us has seen a team slide that looks kind of like this. It's a laundry list, and people, when they speak to these kinds of slides, will say something like, here's where we've gone to school, here's what companies we've worked at, all that kind of thing. And you just kind of get lost in the details, right? But here's the thing, differentiation as a team trumps credibility every time. And so instead of thinking about it as this laundry list of all your accolades, write a single sentence description. This was also from that 500 Startups demo day, and this is what they said along with this slide. Now, first of all, you can see the slides very clean, but they said, our founding team is made up of a mix of Google engineering, 15 years of UX, UI, and a tech exit while in college. So from this one sentence, I get a sense of their background, their qualifications, and even their previous successes. And they did it all in one single sentence. So then when it comes to why now, I want you to think about this. So when you're an entrepreneur, you're always thinking about execution, right? You're thinking about, how do I get to the next step with my business? But when you're talking to investors, this is the world that they live in. They live in the world of global trends. They're looking around them to see what's happening in business, what's happening in the world. And it's like a 10,000 foot view, right? What brings them together is your story, if you're doing it right. And so when you say why now, this is the question you want to be asking yourself. What's changing in the world of your customer that makes it the right moment for your idea? So in every movie, right, if you think, Star Wars is probably the best example, right? But every movie does this. There's an inciting incident. Something happens to the protagonist that sparks and begins their journey. For Luke in Star Wars, it's when, his planet's blown up and his parents die. Okay, now he's on his hero's journey. It's the same way when it comes to why now. And the more you can connect global trends that your investors are thinking about to the idea that you're pitching, the more successful you're going to be. All right, finally, let's talk about the promised land. This is your closing vision. And I want you to go back to that Atlas pitch that you watched. Here's a sparkline, right? Here's that contrast that we're looking to develop. And here's one of the last things she said in her presentation. She said, can you imagine how transformed your community will be when cities can stop using Pinterest and instead click a button to buy everything from software to sensors on the Atlas? We can. So here in one single sentence, she is highlighting what the world's going to be like for cities and what's it going to be like for your community when the Atlas is up and running. So she uses the sparkline perfectly in her language and ends the pitch with that new bliss moment that we're looking for. Contrast, I mentioned it at the beginning, and I just want to leave that with you again, that the more you can do that, even from sentence to sentence, from idea to idea in your elevator pitch, you're going to have a stronger, more persuasive pitch for an investor to listen to. So where do you start? Well, after this session, Ha is going to email you guys this template that I've put together. It's a storytelling framework. Think of it almost like a Mad Lib for your elevator pitch. I use this all the time when I'm working with startups. A lot of times if I have 2 or 3 people in the room that I'm working with, we'll each fill out our own, and then we'll share it out with each other. And we'll do it in like 10 or 15 minutes. The idea is just to get some prompts, creative prompts that we respond to start getting things on paper. And once you've done this, what I've always found is that there's some language that surfaces or an idea that you connect to that then can become something that may end up in that final elevator pitch. So I encourage you to use this as a really helpful and generative tool as you're working on your own. And always remember that your pitch is something that's alive, right? It's going to be changing. You're going to be iterating on it from, every couple of weeks, right? It's a prototype. It's an iterative document. You'll pitch someone, you'll get some feedback, and you'll want to change that. So don't be discouraged by that. Think about it as your first prototype, and have fun just honing it in and getting it to a place where you feel like it's really working for you. So thank you guys so much for your time, and now we can go ahead and transition to Q&A. So I'm going to stop sharing and we can jump right in.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. Really appreciated all your detailed advice. I hope everyone was listening and taking notes. And just so everyone's aware, we will be sharing out the recorded video following the session. So if you need to go back and review and practice, those resources will be there for you to do so. So Stephanie, I wanted to ask you a question to kind of kick us off, and then, founders, folks on the line, be sure to ask your questions in the chat so we can get going on Q&A with the audience. But I wanted to kick us off. Well, you've worked with many, many founders, specifically on their elevator pitch. You've seen time and time again the areas that founders, typically make pitfalls. What is one kind of key area that you consistently see over and over again? And what's your recommendation for founders to avoid that one pitfall?
Okay, let's see. It's hard to give just one, but I think I'll give two. We can talk about either or both. But number one is that the problem is too complex. So again, we live and breathe whatever problem we're solving every day. And so we've got a lot of data. We've got a lot of research that we've done on it. And what I've seen consistently in elevator pitches is spending too much time on the problem before moving to the solution. And so that's why I even like to talk about problem as problem solved, right? Because that's the key that we're getting at. Yes, we have to illustrate that there's an opportunity here, that there's a place for our problem, but more importantly, we have to show how we solve that. So I mentioned story as one of the great ways to do that. I think when you're using data, which can also be powerful for that, it's really about limiting yourself to what is going to illustrate your problem very clearly, but without going into too much detail. Again, because you're talking about an elevator pitch, and when you move beyond that and you get to maybe a longer conversation or even that Q&A follow-up, an investor's going to want to know more, and that's where you get, here's more of my data, here's more of my research, here's what we've done, here's people we've talked to. But in the pitch itself, you almost want to curate one or two things that are going to tee up your problem enough so that you can move to the solution.
Fantastic. Okay, so we've got some questions coming in, and Brandon's going to help me make sure that we can get as many questions as we can answered. So we're going to kick it off and start with Maria Tamilini. If you could unmute and ask your question live.
Yeah, so thanks for this great presentation, great examples. And one thing that I was thinking, when you have a B2B2C model and you have value for the customer and value for the user, how do you approach this storytelling is one of the questions. And the second one, if you remember any great examples, I would love to do some research about them. Thank you.
Great question, Maria. So the B to B to C, right? So you have essentially two people that benefit, right? You've got the business itself that is the one you're selling to, but then their customer. So in that case, here's what I recommend. Focus on the customer for the problem solved. And then when you get to business model, right, how it works, focus on the business. That would be my number one place to start. And, I can't say that it's across the board how you might approach it, but the example I could give you, a couple years ago, I was working with a young entrepreneur out of Stanford, and he was working on a company financial solution called Onward. And Onward, they're based in Kansas City, but what they do is they provide employers that are mostly employing think of like blue collar workers, people in manufacturing, stuff like that. It's an employer program that enables them to offer savings and eventually lending to their employees. So the problem that he was trying to solve was that a lot of low-income people, when they get into a pinch where they've got a car problem or something like that, where they don't have the money in savings, they end up going to a payday lender that's charging just crazy amounts for them to get that $500, $1,000 loan, whatever it is, to just make it to their next payday. So he thought, well, what if companies had a program that was both like a savings program, right? You're taking money out of the paycheck to be able to put aside, but also that the company itself could say, you know what, I'm going to lend you that $200. You know, you've been saving, you've been with us for a couple of years. It actually benefits me as an employer to do that because you're going to be able to keep coming to work, right? You're not going to have to, you know, not be here because you don't have a car to get here or whatever. And so it's definitely B2B to C, right? The person, the employer is the one that has a lot of benefit from it. But the person, right, that ends up now going, I can loan this from my, you know, savings account / employer versus getting it from a payday lender, was what we really focused on in terms of storytelling. That was the core thing we were solving. So I always recommend, you know, start with that because that's going to be the most powerful transformation and change versus the company itself.
Fantastic. Our next question comes from Ashan and Kadisha's Zoom. I'm assuming it's a shared account. You're up next.
Hi. So my question is whether or not you can use your personal story to explain why now, if that's okay, or if should you try to make it very general and have like a fictitious person, but if your own like personal story and how you became passionate for your startup ties into why now, is it okay to use that, or is that like frowned upon?
Really good question. I think personal stories are great. In fact, I think the more real a story is, the more powerful it is. So, you know, there is sometimes help in illustrating it through a fictitious person. You know, if you were walking through how it works, you know, more of the product demo. Okay, so you're Nick and you're a student at this university and you're looking for scholarships for next year. Sure. But actually the more powerful way is to go with a personal story, something from your own life, someone that you know directly. In terms of does that play into the why now? I think it can. And I would still encourage you to go broader in brainstorming why now. Because, you know, there is a power in personal experience. And when that is reflective of broader trends, or there's, you know, kind of evidence that that's not just, you know, my experience, but a lot of others, that's going to really help make a case that this is a problem big enough, right? Because I think that comes to the size of the opportunity. I want people to understand that this is big. Now, in the examples that I shared, Scholly, let's talk about them for instance. We don't even really need to go into how big of a problem this is because we know how many we know there's a lot of college students, there's a lot of people that want to go to college, right? We don't necessarily need to define that in an elevator pitch. But you would, if you had like 30 minutes to talk to an investor, want to go, here's specifically how much money is out there, you know, for scholarships that it's just money left on the table, right? Nobody's getting at. Or here's how many students are actually, you know, that have scholarships. That's where your data might come into play in a longer conversation. So I think, you know, starting with a personal story is great, but move beyond that to go, where can I find validation in global trends, in data and research that's out there.
Fantastic. Okay, we're going to go next to Jeremy Evans Smith. So Jeremy, if you can turn your video on, you can ask your question.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Really appreciate your expertise, Stephanie. Just wanted to check in and see if you had any thoughts on how we could potentially differentiate our pitch or storytelling with early customers versus early investors. That's been something that I think there's a lot of overlap in the I've had, because I'm currently fundraising and it's going pretty well, but I constantly find myself sitting in this gap of like, do I change it a little bit or not? So,
mm-hmm. And Jeremy, are you using the same pitch right now?
I'm not using the same pitch right now because I feel like I've like fortunate enough, like my head of product is really good with personas and like UX, and so it's like we should have an investor persona and we should have like various customer personas. So right now it's not the same, but there is a lot of overlap, and I don't necessarily feel like it's 100% differentiated or exactly where I should differentiate. So, I mean, the good news is like we have some initial paying customers and like we have a term sheet, so it's going well, but I don't feel 100% confident. So, would just like to hear, thoughts on that. So.
Yeah. So the reason I ask if you have a different one, and I'm glad to hear that you have personas, because I always think it's super important to be able to get to start with whoever your audience is. You know, if it's an investor, they're going to be looking for different, signaling and things in that pitch than somebody that's a customer.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the key things to keep in mind is that value and benefit might be different.
Mm-hmm.
So what I found, for instance, is that a lot of times, the problem solved is really similar. There could be some story overlap there, some analogy overlap, whatever kind of storytelling devices you're using. But when you get to what's the value, with an investor, you're going to want to dial that up, right? You're going to want to talk about value in terms of market sizing, and launch market, all those kinds of pieces that I talked about in the pitch. And with a customer, I think one of the most helpful things you can do with a customer is look at value directly to them, potentially through a case study if you have it, or like some results from an early pilot.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something that's really going to speak to their bottom line. So, customer-wise, you almost want to come at it from benefits to their bottom line, what you're bringing to them that they didn't have before. And with an investor, you're really looking at the value is how much of this market can we own, right? And pipeline, all that kind of stuff. So you're kind of going bigger picture on the value side than you would with a customer.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Welcome.
Okay, our next question comes from Titi Naomi. You can ask your question live, and please turn on your video if possible.
Hi, everyone. Yes, my question is, how do you close the gap between what the community you're servicing and the story, or what's now to what could be? So for example, my solution really centers around the underserved, typically the overlooked. And as we understand it, the long-term implications of this actually could address larger groups or the majority of people. So how do you intend to close the gap between people who may not have the same lived experience, and so they may not understand just the small microcosm of the group you're speaking about?
Really great question. Really great question. And I think, there is a lot of case for, focusing in on that initial customer or launch market. And yet investors want to know that this is going to grow, that there's opportunity for it to grow. And so I think one of the things that I've done with startups that I've worked with is really dialing in, okay, again, focus on that launch market because you want to show that you have a path to get there. But then at the end, of your pitch, you can include a line where you're talking about how this might scale to other people, other solutions. So one example of that is, it's actually a battery company I worked with. So it's a very kind of technical thing, but they're working on basically like thermal battery coverings that are used to protect the battery from fire, melt, explosion, that kind of stuff. I mean, if you ever got a lithium ion battery in the mail or your iPhone, you know that it can explode, right? Everyone's seen one of those videos. So they're working on tech for that. Their launch market is electric scooters, and they have like huge growth in Taiwan right now, where there's a lot of people using electric scooters. But it's something that can be, it's a technology that can be replicated and used in a whole lot of other products, right? If we just think of all the products that are battery powered. So they really found that, focusing on the traction that they had in the EV scooter market was really, really important. But at the end, showing, okay, here's how that could work for robotics, for the aerospace industry, for electronics, all these other places. And then again, pipeline, right? We're actually talking to a couple of these people already in robotics and in electronics that want to use our solution as well. So I think the key is to, you also don't want to be too broad at the beginning. And I think probably the bigger miss early stage is you do go too broad. You're like, oh, there's so many different companies that could use this. And people are like, that's great. Where do you have traction? So that's why I think the launch market's the most important early on, right? How are you going to break into this market? What's your strategy? When you're talking about its expansion, having that at the end of a pitch where, again, an investor could dig in a follow-on conversation, that would be my recommendation.
Fantastic. And, taking that conversation on your TAM, your SOM, we're going to have Errol Williams ask his question next. And I think this might be our last question. We'll see if we have time for one more. But if not, this will be our last. Errol, please ask your question.
Hi, yeah, thanks a lot. Really good discussion so far. My question is about market sizing. That can be a pretty difficult thing to get precise. And big question for you, but you have the bubble in terms of total addressable market down to your focus market. One, how much weight do you put on that when you see it? And two, as a result, how much effort do you suggest founders spend on getting pretty accurate with market sizing?
Really good question. And I know this is like the headache for so many founders. It's just like market sizing. How do I do this? And I have found that this is one of the areas of the pitch that really evolves over time. So, I think you're going to keep working it and keep working it. In the context of elevator pitch, I think it's one of those things where don't overthink it. I mean, spend some time on it, but don't overthink it, right? What you're wanting to illustrate is the bigness of the opportunity. So going to the Atlas pitch, the 1.6 trillion that cities are spending. I mean, if we really wanted to dig into the weeds of that, we're like, well, but how much are they spending on solutions that they might find on the Atlas? I mean, we could ask these questions. But really, we know how many cities there are in America. We don't even need to know how many cities to know that there's a lot, right? There's a lot of municipalities buying solutions. That's enough for me to know this is big. And so I don't need to go into more detail at that point. But, and I caveat this because, from a storytelling perspective versus like a business strategy perspective, I'm not the expert on, how you actually computate all your market sizing, but I do think you just kind of have to state a number and just stick with it. And if investors want to question that, they will, they'll follow on and go, well, yeah, how much of that can you really get? They will, and they'll push on it, and then you can adapt it, but stick with what you have. Be ready to just defend your logic in terms of why you picked that or how you came up with that answer. I mean, that's the big thing that you're not going to be able to have in an elevator pitch, but you're going to want to follow on. Well, how did you get that number? Oh, okay, let me show you exactly how I got it. So be ready to answer that question. And they may question whether you did that, whether that was right or wrong, but be ready to just answer that question. And then again, I think this is where the launch market comes into play and why it's actually easier and more important in an elevator pitch is we have a way to get this market. We have a way to take a chunk out of it. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And for everyone on the line, really appreciate you sharing an hour with us to help us better understand how we should be crafting and honing our elevator pitch. I think to Errol's question and to some of the things you were stating just now, founders, come join us next week. We're going to talk more about your pitch deck. So go into greater detail, and Stephanie is actually going to come back to help walk us through that as well. So if you're looking for, okay, I think I can figure out my elevator pitch based on this conversation. How do I take that one step further when I'm ready to send, that flat deck or leave behind pitch deck to an investor? Tune in, register next week, bring a friend. Don't forget, we're going to send out an email with the NPS survey. So we'd love to get feedback on this session. Want to make sure that we're continuously improving. So please, if you can, fill out that NPS survey. And at the end of the survey, we'll ask if you want to be placed into peer groups. So it's something that Spiro is experimenting with, but we want to facilitate connection within the groups of founders who are attending these series. So if that's something you think you would be interested in, please just elect to be involved, and we'll reach out to you for further instructions from there. So thank you so much, Stephanie. We really appreciate your time, your expertise. And to everyone on the call, thanks for tuning in, and hopefully we'll see you and a friend next week.